The lecturer is Dr. John W.I. Lee. Dr. Lee is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. A specialist on warfare in the ancient Mediterranean world, Professor Lee received his Ph.D. from Cornell University. He has conducted field research and has led travel study groups in Greece and Turkey. He is director of the Ancient Mediterranean Studies program at UC Santa Barbara and co-organizer of the University of California Multi-Campus Research Group on Ancient Borderlands.
All things considered, it's a pretty modest building. On the plain of the river Pulvar, at a place called Pasargadae in southern Iran, stands a tomb. Built of limestone, this tomb has a small house-like chamber on top of a stepped platform. Altogether, the whole thing is less than 40 feet tall. At first glance, it's hard to believe that this is the final resting place of one of the greatest empire builders in world history. Today, no trace remains of the inscription that ancient writers say once adorned the tomb. O mortal, I am Cyrus, the son of Cambyses, who established the Persian Empire and ruled over Asia. Do not grudge me, therefore, my monument. Who was this Cyrus? Where did he come from? And what kind of empire did he create? How did that empire grow and change in the centuries that followed? And why does it all matter? How did the king buried in this simple tomb help shape all of world history? Greetings, I'm Professor John Lee, and I'm delighted to be your guide for an amazing journey through the empire that Cyrus founded, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Today, we call it the Achaemenid Empire because its ruling dynasty, the kings who followed Cyrus, traced their ancestry to the Achaemenid clan of ancient Persia. But Achaemenid can be a little bit of a mouthful, so to make things easier, in this course, we'll mostly just call it the Persian Empire. In its time, the Persian Empire was the largest and greatest empire that the world had yet seen. From 559 to 530 BC, under the empire's founder, Cyrus the Great, the Persians rose from relative obscurity to conquer vast territories. By 500 BC, when Rome was still just a little village on the banks of the Tiber River, and China was still divided into many warring states, the Persian Empire had unified the lands stretching from Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt in the west, across Mesopotamia and Iran, through Central Asia, all the way to the Indus Valley in the east. For more than 2 centuries, until 330 BC, the Persian Empire was the single greatest power anywhere on earth. The Achaemenid Persian kings who followed Cyrus were greatly influenced by the principles of the wise sage Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, whose teachings emphasized ethical and moral conduct. The great kings of Persia saw themselves as representatives of truth, justice, and self-control. Amazingly, the great kings also portrayed themselves as good gardeners. They planted trees and created beautiful landscaped parks called paradisa, a word that survives in English as paradise. And near those paradises, the great kings built astounding palaces at Pasargadae, where Cyrus' tomb lies, but also at Susa, Ecbatana, and Persepolis in modern Iran, and at Babylon in modern Iraq. These palaces were covered with gold and silver and were filled with the most beautiful sculptures and artworks. Like most dynasties throughout ancient history, the Achaemenids faced civil wars and fights for the throne, but overall, Persian rule was remarkably stable. In 236 years, there were only 14 kings, an average of 16 years per king, and 2 kings ruled for more than 40 years. What these kings accomplished was truly remarkable. They built an empire of world historical significance. The Persians were heirs to the cultural legacy of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, one of the cradles of civilization. They learned from the great empires that had come before them, such as the Babylonians and Assyrians, and they put those lessons to use on a new world stage. From their origins in southern Iran, the Persians expanded east and west, and as they expanded, for the first time in the history of the globe, all the great civilizations of ancient West Asia were brought together, including the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Jews, and others. The Persian Empire was an empire with an efficient bureaucracy, a postal service, a highly complex economy, and a powerful army. The Persians themselves numbered only about 1 million people, but they ruled over a multi-ethnic and multicultural population of at least 25 million. They were able to do this partly because they were an empire of information with impressive communications networks and administrative systems. But the Persians also succeeded because they were tolerant imperialists who allowed their subjects to practice their own religions, maintain their own customs, and enjoy local autonomy. It was the great king Cyrus of Persia who released the Jewish people from captivity in Babylon, allowing them to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple and practice their religion unhindered. Across the vast territories of the empire, people of many ethnicities and many traditions enjoyed peace and stability. Trade flourished, ideas were exchanged, and diverse cultures met and mingled. Under the Persian Empire, new cities grew in Central Asia with names that still stir our imagination today, like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv. The empire also made possible new trade routes that crossed the enormous lands of Eurasia, routes that would become the beginning of what we today call the Silk Road. For the first time in world history, Europe and Asia were in direct, sustained contact with the stability of a single empire to promote trade and exchange. As far away as South Asia, the Persians influenced the development of ancient India's writing and coinage. And even after the empire ended in 330 BC, the Persian legacy continued. Persia's example influenced the succeeding dynasties of the Seleucids, the Parthians, and the Sasanians, who ruled ancient Iran. In fact, in some ways, the Persian Empire set the pattern of Iranian civilization for almost 1,000 years. Even after the coming of Islam in AD 651, elements of ancient Persian culture lived on. And the old Persian language spoken by Cyrus and his successors was never forgotten, and it evolved over time. Modern Persian, or Farsi, is still spoken today by more than 100 million people in Iran and Central Asia. What's more, even in modern times, Cyrus and the Persian Empire have been revived and reimagined by people both inside and outside Iran. But for all these amazing achievements and enduring legacies of the Persian Empire, many today have another image of this empire. You might ask yourself, what does that image look like? Well, oftentimes when people think of ancient Persia, they imagine despotism, decadence, effeminacy, barbarism, and slavery. How could such an image come about? Well, it's because images of the Persian Empire have long been focused through the lens of its interactions with a small yet highly influential people, the ancient Greeks. During the 5th century BC, the Persians launched several invasions of mainland Greece, where they were opposed by the cities of Athens and Sparta. Against all the odds, the Greeks fended off these invasions in famous battles like Marathon, Salamis and Plataea. And because the Greeks, especially the historian Herodotus, wrote narrative histories of these events, while the Persians didn't, the Greek image of the Persian Empire has influenced many people up until today. In fact, I have to tell you that when I first became interested in ancient history, more than 20 years ago, believe it or not, it was through reading about those Greek victories over the Persians. But the more I learned about the Greeks, the more I saw how much was being left out about the Persians. So, the Greek image of the empire is often seriously off base. The challenge, then, is how to get a more accurate historical picture. How to do that? Well, in response to this negative image of Persia, some folks have tried to turn things around and imagine the Persian Empire as a kind of perfect state, presenting Cyrus and the kings who followed him as ideal rulers. Sometimes they've even overstated or misrepresented the evidence to make the Persians look better. In the process, some people treat the histories of Greece and of Persia as if you have to take sides with one or the other. If you like the Greeks, the Persians have to be the bad guys, and vice versa. In their quest to emphasize the power and achievements of ancient Persia, many times people end up downgrading the Greeks. But that's not much of a solution. It's like replacing one stereotype with another one, which isn't much use if you care about historical accuracy and getting a real understanding of the past. Instead, the true story of the Persian Empire is more fascinating and complex than any one-sided stereotype, whether positive or negative. In this course, then, we're going to go beyond simple demonization or idealization to explore the multifaceted reality of ancient Persia's history. Let me give you just two examples of that reality. First of all, some people will tell you that the wars between the Greeks and the Persians were the beginning of a split between East and West, which endures up until this day. An eternal clash of civilizations, they say. But the closer you look at the realities of the Persian Empire, that idea of a strong East-West split doesn't exactly hold up. During those Persian invasions of Greece in the early 5th century BC, thousands of Greeks fought willingly for the Persian side. It wasn't just a war of Greeks versus Persians. Before and after the invasions, many other thousands of Greeks worked in the Persian Empire as mercenaries, as artisans, as doctors, and advisors. In fact, in the late 5th century, there were more Greek mercenaries in Persian service than there were soldiers in the whole Spartan army. Despite this stereotype of a strong split between East and West, there was a great deal of cultural contact and interchange between Greeks and Persians in the areas of clothing, food, military matters, and perhaps even philosophy. These two peoples, the Persians and the Greeks then, developed side by side, sometimes in very close, very intimate contact with each other. Greece wouldn't have become what it became without Persia, and Persia was deeply shaped by its interactions with Greece. So we need to get past that silly either-or dichotomy. Ancient Greece and ancient Persia are both fascinating cultures that developed alongside each other. They don't represent the eternal conflict of East and West, as has sometimes been imagined. And as for those wars between Persia and Greece, if we look at the entirety of Persian history, instead of just taking the Greek viewpoint of the early 5th century BC, we can see that the Persian defeats in Greece weren't as earth-shaking for the empire as some people would have you believe. The Persians in later years not only managed to restore the balance of power, but scored some major triumphs that essentially made the Greeks reliant on Persia. Only in the later 4th century BC would a new power, the Kingdom of Macedon, arise to challenge Persian supremacy. By looking at the entirety of Persian history then, from Cyrus the Great down to the empire's final defense against Alexander of Macedon, instead of restricting ourselves only to certain parts of the story, we get a more accurate understanding of the past. For a second example that illustrates the complexity of our subject, consider Persian tolerance. People who want to rehabilitate or idealize the Persians often point to the empire's tolerance of local customs and religions. The most famous case of such tolerance, of course, is the Jews and Jerusalem. As we'll learn, the Persians were in fact tolerant imperialists. They didn't impose their own laws, language, or customs on the people they conquered. But the Persians weren't tolerant because they were perfect, or even exceptionally idealistic. Instead, they were tolerant because they were pragmatists. Simply put, it was a matter of numbers. There was only about one Persian for every 25 imperial subjects. With that ratio of rulers to ruled, there really wasn't a good option for success other than being tolerant, because the Persians just couldn't watch every nook and cranny of the empire. And we can't let the fact of Persian tolerance blind us to another fact. The Persians were imperialists. The Persian Empire may have governed through tolerance, but it expanded by force, not persuasion. Like pretty much everybody who has ever built an empire, whether in ancient or modern times, the Persians weren't in it out of charity. They built their empire so that they could enjoy power over others, so that they could become rich, so that they could enjoy the fruits of other people's labor. That doesn't make the Persians especially bad, though. In fact, it makes them like other empire builders. And that's one very important goal for us. If we can get past seeing the Persians as simply demons or angels, we can recognize how they compare to the many other important empires of the ancient world, such as Rome or China. In some ways, the Persians were very similar to the Romans and Chinese, but in other ways, their empire followed a very different path. In fact, if you're interested in the history of empires in general, the Persian Empire makes an especially fascinating case study. For example, the Persians had a special set of strategic and political challenges. Sure, their empire was enormous, but from the very beginning, the Persians also had to deal with several older, more advanced, more populous civilizations within the borders of their empire, especially the Egyptians and Babylonians, both of whom had long imperial traditions of their own. The Romans didn't have quite this sort of challenge, nor did the Chinese. And, unlike the Romans and Chinese, who both put a uniform stamp of culture, language, and organization on their empires, the Persians didn't impose a single imperial culture on their subjects. What did that mean? Well, it meant the Persian Empire had to deal with the downsides of diversity in many areas, from having to coordinate many different kinds of troops in imperial armies to using multiple languages for administration. Local diversity also made the Persian Empire very loose in some respects compared to the Chinese and the Romans. As we'll see in our travels together, the Persians relied on a mix of satraps or provincial governors, client kings, and local semi-autonomous cities to govern their empire. That meant the empire had overlapping and sometimes conflicting spheres of authority. And there were even some areas inside the empire, especially in mountains or deserts, where imperial control didn't reach at all. Don't get me wrong, the great king did have a lot of power, but overall the Persian system was not as tightly controlled as the Chinese or Roman imperial systems. The Persian Empire is also fascinating for the way its imperial boundaries worked. If you think about the Romans and Chinese, they're both famous for their border fortifications. Hadrian's Wall for the Romans, or the Great Wall of China. The Persians, in contrast, ruled an empire whose borders were often porous or ambiguous. For example, in Central Asia, nomads traveled in and out of the imperial territories, while in western frontier zones like Asia Minor or Anatolia, it was sometimes very ambiguous whether a specific city was in or out of the empire. The Persians also had more challenging geography than the Romans or the Chinese. The Romans had the Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, or our Sea as they called it, to speed communications. The Chinese had great rivers and canals. The Persian Empire, though, didn't have many natural boundaries or frontiers. and its territory included many different zones that didn't knit easily or smoothly together. For example, Egypt was separated from the rest of the empire by a difficult waterless desert. Along the northern reaches of the empire, the steppes of Central Asia were hard to defend. And to get to the Indus Valley, the far eastern reaches of the empire, you had to cross a series of difficult mountains. Finally, if you are interested in how empires rise and fall, the Persian Empire is especially fascinating for the speed with which it grew and collapsed. The Persians exploded onto the world stage in a very brief time, just a few decades, under the rule of Cyrus the Great and his son Cambyses. Unlike, for example, the Romans, who grew more gradually over the centuries. And in just a decade, the attack of Alexander and his Macedonians crushed the empire. What does that mean? The Persian Empire is a great case study in the life cycle of ancient empires. By studying it, we can really see how the right conditions and the right leaders can drive rapid historical change. So, if you're interested in how empires work, the Persian Empire deserves a look. But there's something else, too. Studying the Persian Empire these days is especially exciting because it's a relatively new field of history. 30 years ago, Achaemenid history didn't really exist as a separate area of study. Why is that? Well, one answer is that for a long time, the most accessible sources for studying the Persian Empire were those Greek historians, like Herodotus. Now, the Greek sources often painted a fairly negative picture of the Persians. It is, though, important to note that not even Herodotus offers a totally negative perspective. In some ways, in fact, Herodotus can be pretty admiring of the Persians. For example, Herodotus commends the Persians for having good laws, notes that they value truth above all, and praises the bravery of Persian soldiers. Some of the other Greek authors who wrote about the empire, such as the Athenian historian Xenophon, also had good things to say about Persia. In similar fashion, some of the first Europeans who traveled to see the monuments of ancient Persia had very positive reactions. For example, they spoke of the beauty, the power, and the dignity of the palaces at Persepolis. And in early modern European literature, from the 1500s to 1700s, the Persian king Cyrus the Great comes off very well, especially because of his favorable portrayal in the Hebrew Bible. English playwrights of that era, for example, describe Cyrus as noble, just, and merciful, a restorer of liberty. But then things changed. Starting with the rise of European imperialism in the early 19th century, people began playing up the negative side of the Greek image of Persia. As Western Europeans began to identify themselves with the ancient Greeks, they more and more started to see the Persians as nothing more than the bad guys of ancient Greek history. For many people, the Persians became a convenient target for all sorts of stereotypes about the unchanging, decadent Orient, and an excuse for European imperialism in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia. Now, this change also took place in the US. As a college professor who loves teaching, in fact, I got really interested in this process of how ancient societies get presented in different ways over time. So I headed to the library and I read a bunch of American college textbooks from the 1800s and 1900s. Exciting stuff, I know. In these textbooks, you can actually see this process in action. In 19th century textbooks, for example, writers go from describing the Persians fairly positively to calling them despotic, decadent, barbaric Orientals. By 1900, a popular school book used for Greek language teaching summed up the new view. One Greek was better than 10 Asiatics. And believe it or not, that textbook is still in use today. What's the result? Well, in almost every college or university in the United States, you can take classes in Greek and Roman history. But even today, only a handful of schools offer courses on the history of the Persian Empire. Sometimes, Greek history courses only include the beginning and the end of the Persian Empire, so students don't learn or understand how the empire developed in the centuries between 559 BC and 330 BC. In popular culture, too, that old tendency to vilify the Persians still crops up. Because of the geographical and historical links between ancient Persia and modern Iran, some people have a tendency to over-identify the two. They see the Persian Empire as despotic and authoritarian, the opposite of modern Western democracy and freedom. And Hollywood, unfortunately, has really played up this angle. In the recent movie 300, for example, the Persians come off as faceless, inhuman monsters, and their king looks like he's deluded and sexually deviant. Against this old tradition, though, a new view of the Persian Empire is emerging. More and more scholars around the world have challenged old stereotypes about the ancient Persians, and this has led to an extraordinary flood of new research on the Persian Empire, with new texts and new archaeology being discovered and old views being re-examined. My own research on ancient warfare and Greek-Persian interactions fits into this stream. What does that mean? Well, it means that a lot of what we're going to talk about in the coming lectures is based on really recent research. So, if you hear something that doesn't totally match up with what you might have learned in your college class on ancient history, don't be surprised. That's simply because scholars today are really re-examining every aspect of the empire. And that's what we're going to do too. Together, we're journeying in search of a more accurate, more balanced portrait of ancient Persia. Now, there's one more question to address as we begin this course, and maybe you've thought of it already. What's the difference between Persia and Iran? Now, today, there's a nation-state called Iran, which some people still prefer to call Persia. Ancient Persia is part of the historical and cultural legacy of modern Iran. But it's important to remember that that doesn't mean the ancient Persians are the exact same people as the modern Iranians, any more than modern Italians are the exact same people as the ancient Romans. In fact, not until many centuries after the Achaemenids did the idea of Iran as a national group develop. In this course, then, we're going to use the terms Persia and Iran in very specific ways. When we talk about the Persians, we're referring to the ancient people whose homeland was in the ancient region of Parsa, or Persis, as the old ancient Greeks knew it. This region, Parsa, corresponds to the modern Fars province of southern Iran. When we talk about the ancient Iranians, we mean a set of people who inhabited a wide region, stretching in fact outside the boundaries of the modern nation-state of Iran, from the Ukraine to modern Iran into Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, and beyond. These ancient Iranians shared a similar culture, and they spoke similar but not identical languages. The language of the ancient Persians, Old Persian, was one of these Iranian languages. So, in other words, if the ancient Persians are a specific group from one particular area, Fars, in a larger region, then you can think of the ancient Iranians as their wider set of cousins. With this distinction in mind, we're ready to embark on the next step of our journey. In our next lecture, we'll examine the sources for the history of the Persian Empire. And you might have been thinking, well, why haven't folks used other sources than the Greeks? Well, as we'll see next time, it's not that there aren't other sources. There are lots of them, but they're very diverse, and some of them are very tough to use. For example, to fully grasp all the different non-Greek written sources for the Persian Empire, you've got to know at least 6 ancient languages. But at the same time, that makes studying ancient Persia that much more fascinating. As we'll discover, it's a bit like detective work. We can't just rely on one witness, but we have to interview everybody we can find, add in archaeology and scientific research, then put all of our witnesses, all of our sources together in order to get the best possible, the truest and most accurate picture of this amazing ancient empire.